has played such a role, and that in turn has shaped New Delhi's approach to Moscow. This is why India has closely watched and cared about China-Russia relations for decades. In fact, the first time an American president and Indian prime minister met, the subject came up. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru told President Harry Truman in 1949 that what was then the Soviet Union and China shouldn't be seen as a monolith, that their differences would emerge despite their shared communist ideology. Nehru would eventually, though not for a few years, be proven right. And the Sino-Soviet split, when it happened, had deep implications for India. It is for that reason that New Delhi keenly observed Sino-Soviet and subsequently Sino-Russian dynamics, because the state of the Russia-China relationship has affected India and shaped its options. This becomes evident if you consider two wars. First, consider the 1962 India-China War. At that time, Sino-Soviet relations were still close, and when push came to shove, Moscow chose to side with its ally China over its friend India. It provided Beijing diplomatic support, as well as intelligence during the war, and it encouraged India to accept Chinese terms. Furthermore, it stalled the supply of MiG fighter jets to India. Second, consider the 1971 India-Pakistan War. At that time, China and the Soviet Union were at loggerheads. That led Moscow to be willing to side with India when New Delhi needed an insurance policy against Chinese intervention in an India-Pakistan war. The Soviet Union helped India by deterring China, and it provided not just military supplies, but also a veto at the UN Security Council. In both cases, the state of Beijing and Moscow's relations affected New Delhi's options, but they also had implications for Washington. In 1962, when the Soviets were unhelpful or even harmful for India's China strategy, that pushed India closer to the US. In 1971, when the Soviets were helpful for India's China strategy, it drew India closer to them and further away from the US. It particularly resulted in a deeper India-Soviet defense partnership whose legacy is evident even today, and something that Washington has to grapple with even now. But this is not just a Cold War story. And today on the podcast, we're going to pick up the story in the 1990s and consider Russia's more recent role in India's China strategy and how New Delhi is perceiving the China-Russia partnership. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Dr. Nivedita Kapoor, an Indian expert on Russian foreign policy. She's currently a research fellow with the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Before I continue on to the interview, I want to thank all of you for listening to or watching the podcast, providing feedback, and sending questions on social media. I want to highlight that the last episode of this season of the podcast will be a special Q&A episode in which I will answer audience questions about India-China relations. So please do send us any questions you'd like answered. You can do so by posting your question on Twitter or X with the hashtag GlobalIndia, all one word. Or if you'd prefer to submit your questions through email, you can send it to globalindia@brookings.edu. And now let's move on to the conversation with Dr. Kapoor. Welcome to the podcast, Nivedita.
Thanks, Tanvi, and thank you for having me.
Nivedita, I want to start our discussion, as I often do in these episodes, by actually looking back and taking us back, in this case, to the 1990s and 2000s. During that period, what role did Russia play in India's China strategy?
So if we look at the 90s, this was a very interesting time for both India and Russia. Russia, of course, was going through momentous changes, and India also had started its own economic reform program. So at this point, the main starting point was that both India and Russia were trying to first establish themselves, stabilize their relationship with each other, and then rebuild their relationship. Because for India, Soviet Union was a critical partner. And with the end of the Soviet Union, it had to once again reorient its foreign policy. And Russia was, of course, finding its feet after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this is mostly a period of stabilization. And if we look at both India and China, if we compare this, then Russia's engagement with China developed at a faster pace in the immediate Cold War period. So because in the case of China, I think this is discussed quite a bit, that Gorbachev had already started this process. Brezhnev had sort of indicated it, and then sort of Gorbachev took it forward. And at this point, despite the rocky developments in the early Yeltsin periods, things settled down pretty quickly between Russia and China. And China was also, at this point, willing to build relations with Russia. It was also after the Tiananmen Square massacre, when the West had stopped military supplies to China, so it was also looking to get these supplies from Russia. And an opening was provided when Russia and China started discussing the borders, because they had to settle there was this borders between the Central Asian states, Russia and China, that had to be settled. And that sort of provided an opening. And in 1992, these parties reached an eastern border settlement. So that sort of was the first sort of step that was laid down. And Russia was trying to maintain the security of not just ship develop pretty quickly. So in 1995, when the Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrov visited China, he said that both Russia and China had common interests in opposing hegemony and a unipolar world. So by this time, they're already thinking on these lines. In 1996, we see Russia and China declare the strategic partnership. In 1997, they actually sign a joint declaration, which is called the Joint Declaration on a Multipolar World and the Establishment of a New International Order. So a lot of their interests are sort of already converging, and Russia can see that China is emerging. It's growing pretty fast. So China is already sort of this important player that Russia can see. On the other hand, if you look at the Russia-India relationship, it is in the 90s, it is still trying to stabilize itself. So because India was reforming its own economy, and the relations, especially the trade relations with Russia they were pretty rocky in the beginning, because we were trying to settle the dispute over the rupee-ruble exchange rate. There was this dispute about the amount that India owed to Russia. And there were also other issues of connectivity. We couldn't find out there was a very undeveloped banking sector in Russia at that time. So the trade relations could not be established. And once both the economies stabilized, we realized that India and Russia had somehow lost their trade complementarity, and the rupee-ruble trade basis ended. And the small and medium enterprises in India that were emerging in the 90s, they were oriented towards the West. So essentially, both India and Russia were looking to the West in the economic domain. The one silver lining here was the arms trade or the defense relationship that did continue both for India and China. But if we compare, we'll realize that especially in the 90s, the focus was very much inwards, and it was very much on the bilateral relationship. We don't see the triangle sort of India, Russia, China emerging at this point. So that only comes towards the end of the 90s.
And what leads to that triangle coming to the fore, so to speak? Because as you said, it's quite interesting when you mentioned in the 80s, Russia already, or then Soviet Union, reaching out to China with Gorbachev. And one of the things that is linked to in the triangular sense is then India's efforts to also try to stabilize relations with China. So even, the 1988 Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visit, not just shaped or caused by the fact that there had been a big border crisis in 1986-87, but also this idea, as I think Srinath Raghavan has written about, which is that there was concern that, if Russia or so the Soviet Union then was reaching out to China, well, India better protect that flank too. Because India had depended so much on the Soviet Union for that balancing against China. So it's very interesting when you say that in the 90s, in that early period, that triangle kind of, stems a bit or dissipates a bit in terms of its prominence. What causes that? What causes it to kind of return to the fore, that triangular dimension of Russia, India, China ties?
Yeah, this is something that you will hear if you're in Russia. You will hear it repeated every single time. That because it was the Russian foreign minister and later prime minister Yevgeny Primakov who first talked about Russia, India, China. So we are reminded quite often in Russia about the fact that Russia has always aspired for a multipolar world with Russia, India, and China as these three important sort of poles in the system. So in the emergence of this RIC, all three parties had their own interests. If I start with Russia, by the mid 90s and the end of 90s, Russia is already becoming disillusionized with the West. It believes that its position is not being respected. The pro-Western leadership has been sort of sidelined. We see Yevgeny Primakov become foreign minister and then prime minister, and he was very famously talking about having a balanced relationship of Russia with the East and the West. And that is when he proposes the idea of Russia, India, China. And this is somewhere in 1998. But the actual formation of the RIC takes at least a few years. And that is also in the end of 90s and the beginning of 2000s, in 2003, when RIC meeting first happened. In between, we also see the India-China relationship, as you say, sort of stabilize a bit more. We have still not sorted out our border issue, of course. But once the Indo-China ties are normalized in 1988, we do see a willingness to sort of at least have a stable relationship, even if we are not resolving the differences. So once that happens, then India has an interest in ensuring a stable border, both with China. And I think there is a sense that if Russia, India, and China, even if we are just talking to each other, even if it's not an organization that has an implementing mechanism, it does not have its headquarters, it provides a useful platform for negotiations, for talking to each other. So I think India also saw value in that. And Russia of course, sees India and China as its two important partners in the post-Cold War scenario. And if it is getting disillusionized with the West, then it is so then how does it sort of once again regain its position in the international arena? So it has to put forth its own ideas. And RIC is sort of seen as a format where Russia, with its two key partners, can project its strength and present an idea of a multipolar world. Because by now, and this is another common factor, because Russia, India, and China, even though all three were at that time building relations with the United States, they also saw the United States as an important partner. They also realized that this is a hegemonic world. And in that hegemonic world, or a unilateral world, or a world with just one power, their interests are not always met. So they also have an interest in pushing for their demands through a multilateral format. So this common interest, they're not trying to, at this point, they're not trying to balance the United States, but they're just trying to consolidate themselves at this point, because they all have limited capacities in different ways. And they want to consolidate themselves and present their ideas. And you see this sort of carry forward even to the BRIC, because once from RIC we move on to BRIC later, one of the key demands of BRIC is that we want to reform the Bretton Woods institutions, the international financial governance institutions. So there is a dissatisfaction among these three countries about how their position or how their interests are being handled in a world where there's the United States as the sole power. So I think both RIC and BRIC, they're a story of states that are gaining strength, and therefore they want to expand their presence in global affairs. But it is also a story where, by coming together, they're also trying to make sure that one state does not dominate. So when there's Russia, India, and China, China does not get to dominate, because, there's also India and Russia in that equation. So they're trying to also balance each other. So it's both cooperation, but they're still at least India and China are wary of each other.
It's interesting that former Indian ambassador to Russia, P.S. Raghavan, described this period as the three countries essentially searching, wanting non-West platforms, as opposed to anti-West platforms, as you're saying, that it was very much wanting a voice, particularly at a time when they wanted not unipolarity, which was the reality, but a quest for multipolarity. And I do want to come back when we talk about the more recent phase on this concept of multipolarity and whether Russia and India, China, in your view, or at least Russia and India, in your view, do they actually share a view of what that multipolarity looks like? But I do want to kind of, go from this 1990s, 2000 periods to where you did see this kind of triangular relationship work in a much more, I would say, when all the ties were fairly stable in a much more kind of maybe stable, constructive way. You saw eventually the Shanghai Cooperation Organization being formed later on as well, and Russia kind of facilitating India's entry into that. But I also want to kind of take us now maybe to the more recent period from that phase that you talked about, in the kind of 2010s, as we go into, with the Modi government coming in, what was the picture with this new Modi government on kind of this Russia, India, China triangle? Where did things stand?
Yeah, so when Modi comes to power, we do see a very interesting shift already happening with the Russia-China relationship. Because I think it's pretty well known, it's very often repeated, that India would favor a situation where Russia maintains sort of a balanced relationship with China. And if Russia and China get too close, or God forbid if they form an alliance, then that would really hurt India's strategic interests. So in this period, 2000s, 2007, 2008, that is when you see Russia really come out and expresses dissatisfaction with the United States. In 2008, there was the NATO promises that Ukraine and Georgia at some point in future will become members of NATO, even though it does not start the process. And that is one point where, which sort of marks Russia clearly saying that this is a red line for us. So we can see the Russia-West relationship already deteriorating. And that sort of pushes Russia even further towards China. And between 2008 to 2014, when the Ukraine crisis breaks out, and I think that 2014 Ukraine crisis is sort of this breaking point where Russia's relations with the West reach the lowest point, at that point, the lowest point in the post-Cold War period. And that is where we see a real shift in the Russia-China relations. So when the Modi government comes to power in India, the Russia-China relationship is already moving in a very different directions. Of course, New Delhi does not get a vote in how Russia and China engage with each other. But before 2014, the thing was that Russia was really trying to build a multi-vector policy. Of course, China was an important partner, but till 2014, before 2014, I mean, Russia had good relations. It was at least trying to build relations with the EU, with the US, and was also really trying to build relations with Japan, South Korea. Of course, it had India. So Russian intentions at that point were very clear, that China is an important partner, but we do not want to be a junior partner of China. So, we can see the examples of this happening, not just in relations with India. Russia was trying to move into West Asia on its own capacity. In the Russian Far East and the Arctic, it was Japan and South Korea that were the preferred partners for Russia. And there was sort of an unwritten rule that is often talked about, that Chinese companies should have a minimum role in energy projects in the Arctic. So Russia was trying to build all of these different relationships. In SCO is actually a very good example, because Russia was trying really hard to preserve its influence in the neighborhood. So in the case of SCO, it tries to include India. It brings in India, and when China then sort of proposes the name of Pakistan. But the entire idea for Russia trying to bring in India is to make sure that it does not become an organization dominated by China. In fact, China wanted to build a development bank within SCO, but Russia did not want an economically dominant China sort of running the SCO. So it sort of scuttled the idea of a development bank. So it was clear that Russia is trying to sort of balance its relations with China, even though it has limited capacity. And that India it offered India a space that we can engage with Russia on all of these different issues and make sure that Russia has some space when it deals with China. The problem after 2014 is that because Russia and China came so close together because of the Ukraine crisis and the sanctions and the breakdown of relations with the West, that space that was available to India shrunk. So as Modi is coming to power, all of these developments are happening, and that makes it very difficult, because what happens after 2014 is that there are very specific ways in which we see the Russia-China relationship shifting. So for instance, Russia decides to sell Sukhoi 35 fighter planes and the S-400 missile defense system. Before this, China never got the latest weapon systems from Russia. So that happened. The cooperation in energy sector started intensifying because if you look at the Arctic oil and gas projects, for the first time, China gets some of it gets a stake in Arctic LNG too. It gets a stake, its Silk Road Fund invests in Arctic LNG. So we see that earlier, the areas that were sort of not the main areas of cooperation or where Russia was trying to preserve its independence, even those areas we see that China sort of now gets a preferential treatment. And on the other hand, because of Russia's own weaknesses, its so-called pivot to the east did not really work out that well. So China becomes the central partner and other partners sort of become sort of less important, or the relationship is not as deep as it is with China. So it's amidst all of this that we see a Modi government taking power, and then it also has to respond to its own relations with China.
And it's quite interesting you mentioned that 07-08 period as being kind of a time of change in both kind of how Russia sees the West and therefore how it sees China. It also happens to be around the time that previous guests have mentioned that India-China relations start to become of greater concern in New Delhi, that China's assertiveness. And so it's interesting that that turning point actually coincides. So to the students out there listening, this is a great period to actually research in terms of dynamics of what was going on there with various dyads and then triangles as well. But I think it's also interesting, you do see at this period, as you're saying, you know, the Modi government comes in and these efforts to try to actually say, despite, as you're saying, that, you know, these Russia's pivot to the east in some cases not having great success, but India and Prime Minister Modi himself trying to actively say, look, you know, Russia, remember you're an Asian country too, not just a European one, and wanting to do more kind of with India and not just China in Asia. But I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more. I do want to talk about how two things, and you can take them simultaneously or, you know, separately, but how two developments affected how India sees or saw the Russia-China relationship and how it thinks it's going to, or how it implicates India's concerns. One is the kind of deterioration of India-China ties, you know, with crises there were border crises in 2014, in 2015, but also then India-China, I think you see more intensified crisis in 2017 and 2020, obviously with the Galwan clash. But the second developing being the Russia-Ukraine war. How have these two things shaped India's view of the China-Russia relationship? And for that matter, how have they actually changed China-Russia relations?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that, you know, these crisis points in India-China relations have had a very wide-ranging impact on our foreign policy. So because it basically shifted our balance of threat perceptions vis-a-vis China. So suddenly India's prism of looking at different relationships, that China becomes incredibly important. So whether it's increasing its alignment with the United States, whether it's dealing with other partners in the Indo-Pacific, apart from its own bilateral equation, the factor of China becomes incredibly important in how India sort of builds its relationships with other powers. And also because Indo-Pacific, Indian Ocean, these are absolutely critical geographies for India. So this framing of India that is shaping its policy with regard to China, that also impacts how it sees Russia's rapprochement with China, and also how it sees Russia's role in its own foreign policy. So it affects both these perceptions. So basically, once the China challenge really started to come forth and India wanted to manage the situation, the logical idea was to look for a major power that has the capacity to sort of balance China. And here, because we already see Russia and China had already gotten too close especially after 2014, the clear answer to India's question was the United States and not Russia in this case, because US was the power that had the capacity to manage China in its neighborhood. So this had a security dimension, it has an economic dimension, and also looking at the regional balance of power, because this is also the region where India wants to position itself as a prominent power. So within this, how India will look at Russia and the Russia-China relationship is how or what, in what way can Russia aid India in its challenge with China? So that is the one question that we'll have to ask, which will have to factor in the Russia-China ties that has already, undergone significant shifts. So here is when the Russia-China relationship becomes more significant, because we get a sense that already Russia's stated goal of establishing a multi-vector foreign policy, that has already suffered a huge setback. And we see that Russia and China sort of start acting together in ways that are very detrimental to the interests of others in Asia. For example, Russia and China conduct joint patrols in East China Sea. Both Japan and South Korea are aggrieved by this. And in an earlier world, Russia would have taken into consideration at least the interests of Japan or South Korea, or at least not tried to overtly subvert their interests. But now, after 2014, Russia is willing to antagonize its neighbors in its cooperation with China. This is actually in the Northeast Asia, in that sub-region, we see this shift happening very clearly. Because in 2022, for the first time since 2006, Russia and China vetoed a UN Security Council resolution on North Korea, on strengthening the sanctions on North Korea. Moscow declared, after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Moscow has declared both Japan and South Korea as unfriendly states after they imposed sanctions. After 2014, Japan and South Korea had not actually imposed most of the sanctions. They continued their relationship. Russia was happy to invite them into the Russian Far East, into the Arctic. And Japan had quite a bit of business investments in the country. So, but after 2022, this completely shifted. So even after 2014, whatever space that Russia had created, or it was left for a multi-vector policy after 2022, that completely broke down. So at a time when India and China are already sort of in a crisis situation, Russia and China continue to get closer. And this is a time when this is not just, about Russia getting closer to China. This is a time when China also sees value in its relationship with Russia. This is not a one-sided relationship, and we cannot underestimate the power that Russia adds to China's relations, to China's foreign policy in general. Because if we look at the region, then if Russia is not China's partner, then China has no other allies. It does not have a network of allies like the United States. So the relationship with Russia is also critical for China. So their interests sort of start converging very significantly. Their military technical cooperation since 2019 has actually increased quite a bit, and a lot of it is shrouded in secrecy. So we are not exactly sure, but we do see a higher level of trust in the Russia-China defense relationship. And now Russia is actually building an early warning ballistic missile defense system for China. So that indicates the level of trust that has increased between the two parties. The economic relationship has grown really close. This year, the bilateral trade crossed $200 billion. I mean, India and Russia, we can't even imagine that at this point. So there's a lot of talk of high-tech sector cooperation, because both Russia and China are facing this pressure from the United States. So there is a possibility that in the future, because of their antagonism towards the West or their ongoing conflicts with the West, they can come together even on areas like high tech. So there's this, because both Russia and China are now in an increasingly antagonistic relationship with the West, that also fuels this relationship. And in that sense, India has gone in that period in the opposite direction, because we have gone towards the West. So even if India and Russia are not directly fighting with each other, so to speak, on any particular issue, there is a problem in the sense that we are both aligned with opposing major powers. That is, one is with the United States, one is with China. So I think I should, at this point, I should stress that till now, Russia has not actually done anything that will directly impinge on India's national interests. But instead, it maintains a close defense relationship with us, even when it knows that India is arming itself because one of its challenges and concerns is China. So it is not that Russia is doing anything directly to harm our interests, but the main problem is that New Delhi is increasingly worried, or it should be worried, because the trend in Sino-Russian relationship, if it continues, then it raises the chances of differences emerging between India and Russia. And I think that is the concern at this point.
Nivedita, I do want to ask you, while we're on the subject, just two follow-ups for our audience who might not know. One, what was Russia's reaction to particularly the China-India crisis of 2020, the border crisis? How did Russia respond, and what motivated or what shaped its response?
Yeah, as that's a good way to sort of present what Russia has been doing, and that's a good question at this point, because just in the previous question, I did want to stress that Russia has not been actively trying to subvert Indian interests, and that was visible after the crisis in 2020, when Russia did whatever it could to make sure that it could bring both India and China to the table. There were talks of a lot of back channels diplomacy by Russia between India and China. And we also saw that because both the ministers from India were in Russia, because Russia was hosting an SCO meeting at that point. And so Russia did provide a platform. It did not, obviously it does not mediate, but it did provide a platform where India and China, because the defense ministers sat together, they talked to each other, and that was sort of at least the point of contact between the two sides, despite the fact that the situation on the border was really tense. So because Russia will repeatedly, you'll hear this repeatedly said in Russia, that the best situation for Russia would be if India and China have a good relationship. Because, you can imagine just how much power it would add to Russia's foreign policy if India and China were not at loggerheads. So it's not in Russian interest to see this exacerbation of Sino-Indian ties. And whenever the tensions happen, it does take a very neutral stand. Till now, it has never displayed any behavior that would suggest that it is tilting towards China in a dispute where India and China are both involved. So in that way, till now, it has preserved its position, its neutrality in the case, at least, of India-China relations, even if, its neutrality in other areas, say Northeast Asia, might be more suspect. But its neutrality till now has not been suspect when it comes to India-China ties.
It's fascinating how much, as you describe that, I'm thinking back to 1960, when then Soviet leader Khrushchev is very frustrated because he wants to see India, China, which were already at loggerheads before the 1962 war, but he is in 1959, 1960 frustrated because he knows what is going to happen if India-China relations are bad, which is that India would move closer to the US in particular, but the West writ large. And so he's telling various Chinese officials, look, sort this problem out, because you're just pushing India closer to the US, and that is not in the interest of the balance of power that we want to see. And when you were talking about that, I was saying this is exactly, just like Moscow then wanted to see India-China make up, in part because it would complicate Soviet interests and now Russian interests if they don't. It very much echoes that period of time. And eventually during that war, the Soviet Union had to make a choice. And that kind of brings me to the follow-up question to the period today, which is, we saw Russia try to kind of stay neutral during continue to supply India, but diplomatically stay neutral during the 2020 crisis. Would that be Russia's response potentially in a future crisis? Is that likely to sustain?
So if we go by the record that Russia has maintained till now, then I would say that it would try its best to maintain a balance in the relationship. And that is also because it is not in Russian interest to lose any more partners than it has already lost. So the United States and the EU are already no longer friends of Russia. We don't know how and when the relationship will stabilize. So if Russia is indeed looking to build its relations in the East, now it really has no other option, then it will need the support of the major powers in this part of the world. And that is both India and China. And if it takes steps that are detrimental to India's security interest directly, then it will lose out India as a critical partner. And that would mean, of course, then India would, for obvious reasons, end up very close to the United States. And that means that Russia will lose a very critical partner in the East. And then there will be absolutely no chance of Russia being able to balance China. Because even now, Moscow does understand that this is an asymmetric relationship. Even, of course, we understand that China also derives benefits from its relations with Russia. But whether you look at economically, whether you look at the future developments, we see that China is the stronger power at this moment. And if Russia, and this gap is expected to grow because Russia is involved in a long war. There are costs attached to it. So Russia is already in a declining position, and a declining state is not in a position to sort of create conditions where it does not have other strong powers. And it cannot just be China, because it needs, at some point in the future, it will need to balance China. It will need to realize that this is a relationship where asymmetry will continue to grow if it cannot present itself with other partners and if it cannot grow itself. So I think the importance of India for Russia will remain, and hopefully, because of its own self-interests that are involved, Russia will stay neutral. Even if, we are not asking Russia to come out in our support. If it stays neutral, that I think would be enough for India.
Yes, I think there's definitely, you're seeing kind of that shift in expectation where even though traditionally and historically the Moscow played a crucial role in helping India balance China and took India's side, as India did Russia's or Soviet Union's against China, that is no longer the expectation in Delhi. It's not about that. I don't think there's an expectation that Russia will take India's side, that, as you said, will stay neutral. I do want to ask about, we've talked about the US, so, a fourth country when we're thinking about this trilateral. Let me throw in a fifth, which is Pakistan. We've seen China try to facilitate Russia-Pakistan ties. How has that kind of triangle, Russia, China, Pakistan, shaped up? And how does India see those efforts on the part of China to kind of broker a Russia-Pakistan relationship?
Yeah, Pakistan has been a really interesting player in all of this. And especially for Russia, the importance of Pakistan increased, especially after the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan. So for a long time, Russia looked at Pakistan through the lens of Afghanistan, because it thought that without Pakistan, it would be difficult to sort of promote its own interests in Afghanistan. And it just needed Pakistan for that reason. But overall, if you look at the bilateral relationship between Russia and Pakistan, we always hear a lot of news of either arms deal happening or some other economic relationships. But what it ultimately results in till now has not been much. Because after 2014, I think it was 2014 when actually the Russian defense minister first visited Pakistan, there were some minor arms sales that were made to Pakistan, but it did not translate into huge orders. The economic relationship also remains pretty basic at this point. There was a lot of talk about a gas pipeline, the Tapi gas pipeline that we always keep talking about for years. Of course, that has not materialized. So in a sense, we have not seen a huge movement forward. And it's also believed to be the case that Russia does not want to antagonize India too much in getting too close to Pakistan. So that might also be a factor in why Russia has tried to sort of maintain a balance and not suggest the creation of a China, Pakistan, Russia triangle sort of emerging. Even now, we did see, unfortunately, Prime Minister Imran Khan was in Russia just before Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine. So it was not very propitious time to be here. And we did here again talk about some economic some economic ties being developed, but also because Pakistan's own situations, internal challenges are quite immense. So that has not translated into a lot of sort of developments on the ground. But eventually, I think in the future, India would like to keep a close watch, especially when it comes to the Indian Ocean and how Russia, because Russia and China do these trilateral exercises with South Africa, they do this with Iran. They also do this. Russia also does exercises with India. But eventually, how China and Pakistan come together in Indian Ocean, and if Russia gets in, it hasn't done that till now, but that might be something to watch out for.
One of the things I find interesting about the Russia-Pakistan defense relationship is, as you said, it seems more always, that Moscow holds out the prospect sometimes to signal India, but you haven't actually seen that much bilateral defense trade. I think the most significant kind of Russia-Pakistan tie in that sense is more indirect, which is kind of Russian engines on the China-Pakistan JF-17 fighter. So it's not quite a direct thing, but so that has remained limited. I do want to ask, Nivedita, you've already touched on a number of these different kind of concerns, but also limits. But if you had to lay out what most concerns India today about, and what it would most concern it in the future about Russia-China relations, what would those concerns be?
I think the main concern here, because the first thing is how India, what are India's foreign policy priorities first? And of course, it's looking at the neighborhood first. And then Indo-Pacific, of course, becomes very critical for us because that's the geography where we are in. Russia has been very, very vehemently critical of these ideas for its own reasons, because Russia is seeing this through the prism of its anti-US position. And it says that these formations, Indo-Pacific and Quad, they hamper the development for multipolar world. But of course, India does not look at these issues through that lens. So I think that is one issue which is critical to India, where there is direct differences with Russia. And here Russia and China, of course, their position matches with both of them oppose the Indo-Pacific and the Quad, and both of them have their differences with the United States, especially in this region. I think another area where India would be concerned is because India depends quite a bit on Russia in sort of maintaining or having a friendly power, let's say in Central Asia and Afghanistan. And if this rising dependence on China, if that combines with the decline in Russian capacity, because, there's a long war going on and it has diverted its resources. So if Russia's decline of influence in Eurasia combines with its rising dependence on China, that severely limits Indian options in Eurasia, because India also has limited capacity. We have not been really able to expand our influence, say, in Central Asia, or even on connectivity issues. So I think that is another issue where India would be really concerned. I was reading about, because I'm not a defense expert, so I am not 100% in the know of these things, but I've read defense experts pointing out that India will need to be careful in the future about how Russia reorganizes its defense manufacturing. Because if it starts sourcing more components from China and retrofitting them into its own defense production, and is that production coming to India? Is that for export? And so the proportion or the percentage of Chinese components in Russian arms exports, that could be something that India might be concerned about in the future. So I think the ongoing war and how Russia is able to reach its end, how its policies shape out after that, I think that will also give us a sense of where Russia-China relationship and where Russia itself is going. So yeah, I think those are some of the concerns I would list.
Just one follow-up, you mentioned kind of the concerns about things like the Quad, and I always find it ironic that, China and Russia complain about the Quad as small cliques, but the original small cliques were actually things like BRICS and RIC. They were the original, well, maybe not the original, but very early minilaterals, long before this became kind of a more Indo-Pacific concept. But I do want to ask on that subject, has the closer Russia-China partnership spilt over into these groupings like the BRICS, the SCO, even at the UN Security Council, I think you mentioned? Has it changed the nature of their interactions there, and has that had implications for India, which is also a member of many of these groupings?
Yeah, so BRICS and SCO, I would definitely say there has been an impact, but I would say that is less an impact directly of Russia-China relationship, but more an impact of the India-China relationship. Because the thing is, BRICS and SCO have established themselves in very specific ways. So, and in the areas in which they work, they do a pretty good job in their limited ways. They're fine at that point. But the next step that both BRICS and SCO, ideally as let's say, if Russia says what it wants BRICS and SCO to do, it would say that we want to expand the agenda of these organizations, and that these would become sort of this basis of a multipolar world, of the formation of a multipolar world, where we can set new rules because we don't like the rules that exist in the world. So these organizations will sort of pave the way for development of new rules. It is here where we see that both the agenda, the expansion of agenda of BRICS and SCO has been pretty limited. We have seen every summit meeting, we see all of these long declarations, but the portion of that declarations that are actually implemented is pretty limited. And they can't expand on a lot of issues because India and China do not agree. So for instance, if you're looking at a single currency issue, or if Russia brings up the issue of de-dollarization within the BRICS format or the SCO format, India does not agree with it because it believes that if we move away from the US-based financial systems, we will end up with the Chinese dominant system. And that hurts Indian interests. So even if Russia and China would want to come together and present ideas, whether it's about regional economic order or new rules, India does not always agree with them. So it does affect the functioning of BRICS and SCO in the sense that an expansion of agenda becomes more difficult. So they remain where they are, but a world where BRICS and SCO can present their vision of a new world order, that is missing. And I think that is a function of the tensions between among the RIC themselves.
We did see Russia and China lay out or outline that new world order in that February 2022 pre-invasion joint statement. It did kind of stress this kind of idea of multipolarity. And we've heard kind of India talk about multipolarity as well, separately, obviously. Two questions there. One, how did India see that joint statement even before the invasion? And second, going back to that question that I previewed earlier, is India's view of multipolarity the same as Russia's or even China's?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question because when it comes to multipolarity, we all talk about it. But the problem is none of us have been able to bring it about. So even if you look at Foreign Minister Jaishankar was actually giving a speech in Russia, must be a couple of years ago, and he said that India and Russia both aspire or both aim towards multipolarity, both as a reality and as an aspiration. So it's a very strange way to use this saying. Either it's a reality or it's an aspiration. Because the problem is we try and create a multipolarity, but we do not possess enough capacity to do it. Because, in IR literature, we would say either there's a balanced multipolarity. So there are several powers which are almost at the same level of capacity and they balance each other out. Or there is unbalanced multipolarity where there are three powers, at least, three or more powers, where one has the capacity to be a hegemon. So that's another kind of multipolarity. We don't see either of those happening. And I really like the idea of what Danny Roderick and Stephen Walt call uneven multipolarity. So we agree that there are more than two powers, but the United States and China sort of surpass the others like India, Japan, Russia. So we have these major powers, but we have an uneven multipolarity. And because India, Russia, Japan, we are the sort of the smaller major powers, on our own, we cannot carry out systemic changes. So when we talk about multipolarity, I get very confused because if we cannot affect changes in the international system, then we cannot say that we have established multipolarity. And I think you're right in saying that our visions of multipolarity sort of differ, mostly because Indian vision would be one where, or to say the Russian vision would be where the US rules do not always apply, or the rules-based order that is always against. It would like to bring in new rules, or it's more of a revisionist power in that sense. Whereas India, for instance, when we go towards the Quad declarations, we say that we accept the rules-based order. We use that language. So we might be dissatisfied with some rules, but we are not trying to subvert them. We are also trying to sort of collaborate with the United States and with the other Western powers. So how do we see this multipolarity being brought about? And whether we can actually bring it about is both a question of dispute, I guess.
So one question, or one thought that I usually hear in India, often hear, less so these days, but nonetheless, that there's this hope that very much like during the Cold War, that yes, China-Russia relations were close, or China-Soviet, but there was a Sino-Soviet split that benefited India, because then India could use the Soviet Union to balance China. We once again hear this kind of hope sometimes expressed in India about a potential Sino-Russian split. So the question I have is, how durable is the Sino-Russian partnership? What are the limitations of it? What could be the sources of friction? And are there things that India can do to shape the nature of the Sino-Russian relationship, or the extent of that relationship?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And it's important that we focus on this because on the one hand, of course, we are already clear that the Russia-China relationship is a very strong one. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. We do see that balancing tendencies have emerged against China. So the relationship with Russia has acquired this very significant strategic value for China. Until China remains engaged in this acute confrontation or its rivalry with the United States, then the value of Russia will continue to be high. And for Russia, we obviously know that China is the key external partner, and in its confrontation with the West, it cannot afford to lose China. So Russia and China right now are in a mutually beneficial relationship. And so the dreams of, sort of driving this wedge between the two and causing a rift, at this point, I think it would be very, very difficult. But at the same time, and Russia and China say it's a no limits partnership, that's what they call it. But there are limits to the partnership. First, it's not an alliance, right? It's a very, very pragmatic relationship. And we need to understand this pragmatism if we are to sort of exploit the opportunities that this pragmatism presents to us. So what do I mean by that? So the thing is, of course, Russia and China right now are very closely engaged with each other at this point. But there are several areas of differences where they try and make sure that these differences sort of do not overlap, or they do not sort of overpower the areas of convergence that exist. So, for example, China does not recognize any of the annexations of Russia, whether Crimea or whether after 2022. Russia does the same when it comes to several of disputes that China has. But in fact, it partners with countries like India and Vietnam, both of whom have active disputes with China. In the ongoing war, of course, we do understand that China is critical to Russia in avoiding isolation. But the thing is that the support is not limitless, or it's not without its profit considerations. So if you see that President Xi Jinping did visit Russia in 2023, and that was a very important signal that Russia is not isolated. But there were actually no major agreements that were signed during this period, during this visit. And Russia was actually hoping that the Power of Siberia 2 agreement would be signed, the pipeline agreement, but it was not. And the main reason is because Russia has lost its leverage on the Power of Siberia 2. And China is now striking a hard bargain. If you look at at Russia's exports to China, energy exports that have gone up considerably, China has made sure that it has a very diversified portfolio of suppliers. Russia is not the key, it's not the only major supplier. So if you look at oil, natural gas, and LNG, Russia's share in the Chinese market is 18%, 10%, and 6%. So there has been no significant increase in FDI from China towards Russia. So it's not replaced the Western investments that have left the region. On the Arctic, it's the other way around, because Russia is a huge proponent of making sure that the littoral states will be the rule-making states. So it has increased cooperation with China in the Arctic because that has become really important now. But there's very little military cooperation with China in the Arctic. And Russia has made clear that Northern Sea route is an internal route, and China has to follow the national laws that Russia has made on the Northern Sea route. In the Russian Far East, there was a development plan between Russia and China, a 5-year development plan that was, I think, from 2014, 2018. Most of it remained unfulfilled, and they had to make a new plan then after 2018, so to make sure that it was, I think, almost about 70 to 80% of its aims remained unfulfilled. So what I'm trying to say by this long explanation is that there are that Russia and China, their interests are converging. So of course they are together, but there are various points where their interests do not always converge, or they put their own national interests first. So in this pragmatic relationship, which is not an alliance relationship, they try and make sure that they help the other party, but never at the cost of their national interests. So there are several points of differences where they believe that the other party can harm their national interests. So those are the points where that will sort of provide an opening to countries like India in the future.
Nivedita, that was an incredibly rich conversation that we've had. You've packed in a lot in the period of time we've had. I do want to ask you one more question, which is what the question we end all our episodes with, which is this question of what is the greatest myth or misunderstanding that you hear about Russia's role in India's China strategy?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, and it's not specifically about Russia's role in India's China strategy, but it's about the bigger role of Russia in general, and then how it impacts India's China strategy. And that is about how a lot of times we hear very extreme positions being taken about Russia. So either some would say that Russia is now completely over, it's involved in a war, and that's going to prove to be its end. Or on the other hand, you will hear other extreme opinion that Russia is this great power, that India needs to, that India's relations with the West, India needs to forget about that and focus more on relations with Russia. What these two extreme positions do is one underestimates Russia, and then the other overestimates Russia. And that can be detrimental when you're trying to figure out how the Russia-China equation is going to develop. So I think if we can try and avoid those extremes, we can figure out exactly what Russia's capacities are, and think that would be a better way to understand both the Russia-China relationship and how it figures in India's strategy broadly.
Avoiding extremes and overestimations and underestimations sounds like a good general, I think, philosophy that we all should have as analysts and commentators and scholars. Nivedita, thank you very much for spending this time with us and explaining the India, China, Russia triangle to us.
Thank you so much. This was such an interesting conversation.
Welcome to Global India. I'm Tanvi Madan, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution specializing in Indian foreign policy. On this new Brookings podcast, we'll be turning the spotlight on India's partnerships, its rivalries, and its role on the global stage. On today's episode, I want to take you back to a notable exchange that took place in August 2022 at the Indian Foreign Ministry's weekly press conference in New Delhi. Three journalists, one Indian, one Chinese, and one Taiwanese, asked the spokesperson about India's position on tensions in the Taiwan Strait following an increase in Chinese military activity after US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi had visited Taiwan. India called for quote, the exercise of restraint, avoidance of unilateral actions to change the status quo, de-escalation of tensions, and efforts to maintain peace and stability in the region, unquote. It also talked about being displeased about the militarization of the Taiwan Strait. This answer from the spokesperson was notable because India has in recent years largely stayed silent on questions around the Taiwan Strait. It was also notable because when the Chinese journalist and subsequently the Chinese ambassador to India pressed the Indian government to also endorse a one China policy, Delhi refused to do so, noting that its position was well known. Like Taiwan, India has also been careful about how it deals with and talks about the issue of Tibet. Indeed, Tibet has been of even more direct concern to India than Taiwan. We'll talk about why on the podcast today, though we won't go into the historical detail that we usually do. For that, I would recommend recent books by former Indian Foreign Secretary Ambassador Nirupama Rao, Professor Berenice Guillot-Richard, and Dr. Kyle Gardner. Today, we will look at how India sees issues and approaches issues such as Tibet and Taiwan. New Delhi knows these are sovereignty concerns for China. Over the last decade and a half, and particularly since 2020, India has been less deferential to Beijing on these subjects, but nonetheless, it remains conscious of Beijing's sensitivities. On today's episode, we will look at how India looks at issues such as Tibet and Taiwan. New Delhi knows these are sovereignty concerns for China. Over the last decade and a half, and especially since 2020, India has been less deferential to Beijing on these subjects, but nonetheless, it remains conscious of Beijing's sensitivities about them. And this consciousness includes being aware of past Chinese anger and accusations about India-US interaction on these subjects. To reflect this aspect, these issues fitting within a US-India-China triangle, today we're going to do something different. I'm going to be in conversation with my Brookings colleague, Senior Fellow Ryan Haas, who leads our China Center and holds our Taiwan chair. We'll exchange views on how India and the US see the issues of Tibet and Taiwan, and whether and how the other country fits into Delhi and Washington's pictures. Before I continue on to the interview, I want to thank you all for listening to or watching the podcast, providing feedback, and sending me questions on social media. I want to highlight that the last episode of the season of the podcast will be a special Q&A episode in which I will answer audience questions about India-China relations. So please do send us any questions you'd like answered or that you wished had been answered during the course of the season. You can do so by posting your question on Twitter or X with the hashtag GlobalIndia, all one word. Or if you'd prefer to submit your questions via email, you can send it to globalindia@brookings.edu. And now onto the conversation with Ryan Haas. Welcome to the podcast, Ryan.
Thank you, Tanvi. It's really a pleasure to be with you on Global India.
Ryan, I want to start from a broader vantage point. And as somebody who's been both a practitioner as well as a scholar and analyst of U.S. relations with China, in those kind of discussions, has India featured in those ties or in those talks between the two countries? And if so, how and why have India featured?
Well, I think that they have featured at an increasing level. And the real headline of my response to your question is that the degree to which India has figured into American overall strategy towards China has only grown from administration to administration. And if you just sort of briefly take it one administration at a time, I think the George W. Bush administration, they deserve credit for pushing forward the Civ nuclear deal that really helped unlock a lot of potential in the U.S.-India relationship. But I think that they viewed India as something that would have windfall benefits for America's overall strategy, less so as a component of America's approach to China. If you look forward to the Obama administration, again, President Obama invested considerably in deepening the U.S.-India relationship. And I think that largely out of sight, there was a deepening discussion that took place. Part of that was a feature of the fact that Jaishankar, Foreign Minister Jaishankar, was the Indian ambassador to China and developed a very robust channel with his counterpart at the time, John Huntsman, who was the U.S. ambassador to China at the time. And then after that, he came to Washington, was the Indian ambassador to the United States, and carried forward those conversations as well during that period. But there was also a deepening architecture of communication, different channels that were open and established, in intelligence and military channels, diplomatic channels, to really sort of move forward the discussion on China. And then from there, you move into the Trump administration. President Trump himself, I think, was tactical and transactional. But his team thought a lot about China and put a lot of energy into deepening the discussion between the United States and India as it related to China. And they put in place, mechanisms to share information and intelligence that have continued to serve a purpose of deepening integration of effort between the United States and India with respect to China. And then in the Biden administration, they are well known for being prominent advocates of the important central role of India in just about everything. Kurt Campbell is famous as saying that the India-U.S. relationship will be the most consequential relationship for the United States in the world in the 21st century. And they've invested considerable energy, both at the leader level and also below, to ensure that the gaps are as small as possible in how each side views, interprets, and responds to events relating to China. But that's sort of the overall arc. I think that there is a open and unresolved question in the expert community about how much potential still exists to push the ball